Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan McNeil, and this is the Builder by Day podcast. Thanks very much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please do me a solid. Click that like and subscribe button. Today, what I want to have a chat about is, we're a little less than 2 weeks now from this upcoming federal election, and I've been doing lots of talking with people about politics, and some political figures have been here. And in the last few months, of course, as you know, it's hard to get away from the political topic. You're paying attention to politics and to the polls and so on. One thing for sure that we all know is that it is pretty much a given now that the baby boomers, the seniors, are ultimately going to be the difference, it seems, in whether this election goes liberal or conservative. Now, I have baby boomers in my life, of course, family members and friends and so on. And I've tried my best to have conversations with those that I know about, just to try to get a sense of, why they're voting a certain way if they're inclined to discuss it. And it's very challenging to have this conversation with the baby boomers, because ultimately the Liberal Party today is not the Liberal Party they think it is. It's not the Liberal Party from not even 10 years ago, but it's definitely not the Liberal Party from 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And many people who are much more in the know than I am, who are in the political world, who are intellects and academics, I've seen many of these folks on television and radio shows and podcasts essentially pleading with the baby boomers, including even a former Liberal MP. I've seen this gentleman floating around a number of times on a number of different podcasts, basically pleading with people his age to please recognize that this Liberal Party is not the Liberal Party you think it is or you used to know. And so from this perspective, for the purpose of this conversation today, for anyone that doesn't know anything about me, which is likely most of the people listening, just to give you a background on where I'm coming from here. I'm just an ordinary, regular guy, okay? I grew up in rural Nova Scotia, and, like many people who grew up in rural Nova Scotia in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, it was a different time than it is now. It was an entirely different time than it is now. And we grew up as, I'm a Gen Xer. But the Gen X folks, of course, as you know, we grew up with baby boomer parents. And our baby boomer parents are now seniors. Myself and many other Gen X folks that I know, now we're adults and we have kids, and we're trying to have a conversation with our parents about what's going on in the world. And it's just fallen on deaf ears. And the reason it's fallen on deaf ears is because it's very difficult for us to compete with the mainstream media, the CBCs and CTVs and global newses of the world, that these baby boomers have grown up trusting, especially institutions like the CBC. And they just don't want to hear it really from any of these news sources and much more legitimate sources nowadays than the CBC. But they just have grown to trust the media that they've always trusted, and they're sticking with that. But back to where I'm coming from on this. I'm just a regular guy, family man, married with children. I own a business. I'm an entrepreneur. I started my business 20 years ago. I consider myself a very typical, ordinary person. And I also consider myself to be of the majority. I mean, of the people that I interact with on a regular basis, of the people that I bump into and have conversations with, almost all cases, I have most everything in common with these folks. So it's puzzling to me that we even have a scenario where this is even up for debate. In my opinion, I don't understand why this isn't a complete runaway victory for the Conservative Party. After 10 years of disaster, of corruption and scandals and incompetence and just, you guys know, I don't need to go into it. Everybody knows what's going on in the past 10 years with the Liberal government, and even in the past 3-4 months with the Liberal government, with this proroguing of Parliament and then inserting Mark Carney, and this guy steps in. Nobody's ever voted for this guy. He's never held political office. Now he's the prime minister of the country. He has an enormously long list of conflicts of interest. He's written a book that very clearly states where he stands and what he values. It's literally the title of the book. But everyone just ignores all of this. They ignore all of it. And they, especially the older generation, the senior citizens and baby boomers, they're just taken by this guy because he's an old gray-haired guy like you, and he seems to know what he's talking about, and he's got an impressive resume. And I understand that. I understand being the governor of the Bank of Canada and the governor of the Bank of England. Those are impressive titles. I'm not suggesting the guy's not smart. As a matter of fact, I'm saying the opposite. He is smart. He's smart enough to know exactly what to say and how to manipulate the situation to tell you what you want to hear to get you to vote for him. But what I'd like to do today is I'd like to, just in very simple terms, in a last-ditch effort, as we are now less than 2 weeks from the election, one last kick at the can here. I want to try to have a conversation addressing specifically the baby boomers. And I want to talk to you about some things that you grew up with and that we grew up with in Gen X, because we grew up as your children. Things that you grew up with that you are now, whether you realize it or not, you are voting against. You're voting against these very things that they are everything about who your generation is. These are in no particular order as I run through them, but basically the way I've set this up is I've made some notes for myself so I don't go completely off on a tangent and you guys lose interest. But I've got a number of things that I want to talk about. I'm just going to quickly mention what it is, how it used to be back then, whenever then is. That could be 40 years ago, or it could be 10 years ago in some cases. There's been such a drastic change in the last 10 years. We don't have to go back to the 70s or 80s to find how different things are now versus then. So I have several things here I want to run through. What it was like then, what it's like now, and then briefly just touch on where the conservatives stand on this particular thing versus where the liberals stand. This is a very layman's term conversation because I'm just a layman, okay? I'm a home builder, real estate developer, business owner, regular guy, and it's amazing to me. I simply cannot understand. I really don't understand how, at this point, how anybody is voting liberal. So I want to run through this, and maybe, if I'm super lucky, maybe somebody can relate to what I'm talking about here, and, who knows? Maybe we change a few hearts or minds. So in no particular order, I want to start running through this. I want to talk about things that were a certain way when you grew up and are no longer that way. And they are things that you as a generation of people and we as Gen X as people, we held to be universal truth. And they shaped our lives and they shaped the way we were brought up and what we know to be true and good. And the first one of those things at the very top of the list, although again, in no particular order, is the two-parent household. Back then, and when I say back then, you can insert whatever year you want, okay? But back then, a stable home, the nuclear family, the mother, father, children, was the gold standard. That was what sort of everybody aimed at. And that, when I grew up, that's what was around me. Of course, there were exceptions to the rule, but now what we have is something entirely different. We have this promoting, the idea of promoting the traditional family has now become, it's now seen as exclusionary or even harmful to some alternative lifestyles. Schools now are pushing books and curriculum that essentially they're attempting to erase the idea of the nuclear family altogether. It goes against all logic and reason and thousands of years of human existence. It's completely irrational, but it's happening. And if you're 70 years old and you've been sort of out of the workforce and definitely out of the school environment for a long time, you may not realize that it's happening, but it is. And the conservatives support tax benefits for married families and encourage parental rights and education, and promote family first policy frameworks. An example of this would be Poilievre has emphasized what he calls common sense family values and parental control over education and healthcare decisions for minors. Whereas the Liberals support gender ideology in schools and programs that downplay or redefine traditional family model. An example of that would be the policies that they back that allow schools to withhold information from parents if a child changes their gender identity, for instance. So that particular issue, a lot of people, that's an emotional issue. People get worked up on that pretty easy. But at the end of the day, you, the baby boomers, grew up in a time when it was a universal known truth in the world. Man, woman, marriage, children, raise your family, teach them to be responsible and good people, equip them with the skills and knowledge that they need to survive in the world, and then send them on their own. And that's how it worked. For my generation, that's how it worked. Because your generation as the baby boomers, you looked at things entirely different than we're dealing with now. So for instance, related to this is the baby boomers. I grew up in a scenario where when you turned 18 years old, you graduated from high school, you were going somewhere. You were either going to university or you were going out on your own, you were getting a job. But it was essentially a scenario for Gen X, the same way it was for the baby boomers, where it was basically, okay, you're grown up now, you're an adult. So I've done my job. We've done our jobs as a parent. Off you go. That's not the case anymore now. Now it is very common for adults to remain at home well into their 20s or, God forbid, even 30s, because, for a number of reasons, they can't afford to be on their own. Everything's more expensive and so on. Another thing on that has changed speaking of school, I guess, is the idea of discipline in schools, right? Back in the day, if you got in trouble at school, the teacher disciplined you or one way or another, you got in trouble, right? And if it was serious, then you also got in trouble at home. You remember those days? I do. I didn't get in trouble a lot growing up because I was a good student and I was well behaved. And, honestly, I don't think I ever really got in real trouble. I know, I had a bit of a potty mouth. I curse a lot. I still do. But as a kid, I was an early bloomer, right? I used to like to carry on with people, make people laugh, and it's hard to be funny and not swear. So, even in elementary school, I used to kind of tell stories and get people going and make people laugh. And sometimes that involved bad language. And I remember one time when I was in the first grade, I came home from school once and my teacher had called school home. And I remember my mom sat me down and said, the teacher said that you said a bad word. And, I was like mortified that I got caught swearing. And, but my mom just said, don't do that anymore. Okay. And that's how it was. If you got in trouble at school, if you did something you weren't supposed to do, the teachers disciplined you. If it was relatively serious, they might make a phone call home, and then you were really in shit, because then you had to deal with your parents. And then if you were really in shit, your mom would intercept that call and she'd sit you down and talk about whatever it was that you got in trouble for. But if it was something bad, then your mom might say something to the effect of, well, we're just going to have to, talk to your father when he gets home. And that was like, oh shit, right? You really screwed up then. But that's not the case anymore now. Now teachers are afraid to discipline students, and misbehavior is excused as a result of systemic injustice, and parents side with the children over authority. So it used to be that you got in trouble, the teacher said something, the parents looked at the kid, looked at the teacher, scolded the child. They didn't side with the child and say, oh, well, it's not little Junior's fault. He's just, he's oppressed, or he's got some issues he has to deal with. No, he has issues already. He has behavioral issues, and you as a parent better deal with it. It's not up to the teacher to deal with it, but the teachers used to deal with it, and now they don't deal with it at all. So the conservatives, they advocate for restoring classroom discipline and giving teachers the authority to maintain order without ideological interference. An example of this is how the conservatives oppose policies that tie teachers' hands with bureaucratic red tape and social justice mandates. Whereas the liberals, they emphasize these equity-based disciplinary approaches, which often reduce consequences for misbehavior to avoid what would they call it? Disproportionate outcomes. And an example here would be to push the restorative justice in classrooms instead of traditional consequences. The public school system for me is, I've talked about this several times in this podcast. The public school system is a problem in this country, in every province. It's a problem everywhere. And it's a problem of, there's an ideological problem going on in the schools. There's some very significant issues in the school that go beyond just disciplinary things. But school is not what it was when you guys were growing up as baby boomers or when I was growing up as a Gen X. Another thing that came up recently that is different then than now is this sense of pride and national identity. So back in the day, you stood for the flag, and the flag represented your country, and you were a proud Canadian. And remember we used to put Canadian flags on our backpacks when we traveled around. If somebody saw a Canadian flag, you were good. If you were traveling around and you went to Europe, wherever it was, somebody saw a Canadian flag, you were gold. And up until like 15 minutes ago, for the past 10 years, up until right around the time they had to change their tune so that they could try to win an election, the Liberals were, anything that related to nationalism was labeled as far right. And then when they realized they're going to get stomped to death in the election and they got to put on a facade, now the Liberals turning around. So what they try to do, what they've been doing the last couple of months, is trying to find a new enemy. So they've made that enemy Donald Trump and the U.S. administration. And they have, in this desperate attempt of all these super cringy, corny, just completely ridiculous things like elbows up, they've wrapped themselves in a Canadian flag, and now they're pretending that the Liberals are this party of national pride, which is complete horseshit because, like I said, up until 15 minutes ago, prior to Mark Carney's entrance and all this facade, having national pride, they labeled as far right. You remember the last few years where there have been literally Canada Day celebrations that were canceled? That kind of stuff never went on back then, but it definitely happens now. The Conservatives emphasize Canadian heritage, history, and national pride. Poilievre often speaks about, or speaks against wokeness and, the attacks on Canadian history, and defends national holidays and historical figures. You've heard these stories about statues being torn down and history being changed and things that we all spent our whole lives being proud about. Suddenly, a handful of people tell us that we shouldn't be proud of that anymore. As a matter of fact, we shouldn't even recognize it. We should tear it down. The Liberals focus heavily on historical revisionism and portraying Canada as a nation built on oppression. They've removed funding and renamed buildings and torn down statues that were associated with Canada's colonial past. And the other thing the Liberals do is they promote critical race theory in education. I'm not going to go into that currently, but you can look that up if you're not aware of it. Another thing that has changed from the time you, as boomers, something that you knew to be a universal truth, and now if you're voting Liberal, you will be voting against this universal truth, is that the path to success was always through hard work. When you were young people and young adults, you worked overtime and you got a second job if you needed more money, and you did whatever you needed to do. If you had the desire to climb the corporate ladder, make more money, then you did what it took. Whether that was a second or third job or putting in overtime, whatever it was. And now there's this complete upside down thing where success is now, by some people, it's like they blame you for being successful. And that blame is pointed toward some kind of privilege that you have. So you're privileged, and therefore, because you're privileged, you're successful. And hard work is dismissed, and instead, those on the left try to make it seem as though it doesn't come from hard work and perseverance. It comes from just what your background is. And it's all about what your background is that will determine your success. And that's complete and utter horseshit. The conservatives are promoting work-first policies, lower taxes, and reduced dependence on government programs. They've pledged to get rid of the carbon tax, which, of course, that idea was then stolen and enforced by the very people who created the carbon tax and then took credit for it. And a bunch of you fell for it. Like 55% of the people out there in a poll believe that Mark Carney should deserve the credit for getting rid of the carbon tax more so than Poilievre. The people who invented it and pushed it all along and then didn't get rid of it, but they've reduced it or brought it to zero, whatever that terminology is, for a very short period of time until this election's over. You guys all fell for it. You're all falling for it. You're actually giving credit to the people who created it for then getting rid of it. And up until like 2 months before they got rid of it, all these MPs and liberal folks were still standing up in front of a microphone or a camera and preaching to you that the carbon tax was in your best interest, was in the financial best interest of 8 out of 10 people. And then suddenly, just like that, they drop it and they say, oh no, it's actually not in your best interest anymore. So, I mean, what was it? Were they lying then or are they lying now? And to come back to what I was saying when it comes to working hard and so on, the liberals have grossly expanded these entitlement programs, and they're even pushing now this concept of a universal basic income. And others examples would be like the growth of programs like, remember the CERB when they were just handing out money? Have you heard of all the government employees, the people who worked for the liberal government, who worked for the CRA and who collected unlawfully, illegally collected CERB money? It's amazing. The corruption and scandals is amazing in that party. But the growth of these programs like CERB and EI extensions and the rhetoric that frames wealth as something to be redistributed instead of earned. So conservative-minded people, and in the old days, those of you who I'm talking to, if you wanted to be wealthy or be rich or have success, and you had to work for it, and you realized that the only way you were getting that was to work for it. And now, the Liberal Party that you baby boomers are voting for, their mentality is that, well, wealth isn't earned and it shouldn't just go to whoever works the hardest. It should just be redistributed from those who have to those who don't have. But what they're not telling you is what's really going to end up happening is the elitists, okay, those who have almost all of it, they're just going to continue to get more, and the poorer are going to continue to become even more poor. Related back to what I touched on when I was talking about schools and some of the disciplinary issues is, and also relates a bit to even the family dynamic that I mentioned, is this idea of gender roles and a clear definition between masculine and feminine identities. Okay? What I mean by that, remember growing up when your son or your nephew or some boy that you knew would do something. You remember the expression, boys will be boys? Well, not anymore. Not anymore. Boys won't be boys anymore because they're not allowed to be. There was a time when boys were raised to be men, strong and capable and protective. Now, masculinity is referred to as toxic. And kids are told they pick up their gender from a list or they invent a new one. We're in this completely upside down clown world where there's a spectrum of genders. It's no longer men and women, boys and girls. It's you just decide what you are, and we'll all just go along with that. But it gets much worse than just sort of having pretend time, okay? Let me just stay on this for a second. The conservatives have pushed back against this gender ideology in schools and support biological sex-based policies. An example here is the supporting of policies requiring parental consent for gender-related changes in school. I mean, this one is crazy to me. The liberals aggressively promote gender theory in public education and in healthcare. And federal funding for programs that promote gender identity transitions for minors. And when they involve the school, they're pushing the idea that they don't want they don't want there to be a need for parental consent. In many cases, there have been countless examples of this information being purposely withheld from the parents of these children. Just imagine for a minute that you have a son or daughter who goes to school, and unbeknownst to you, at some point down the road, they come back and tell you that they're no longer a boy or girl. They've decided to change that. Now they've flipped that to something else. And this has been going on for some time. And the teachers were aware of it, and the school administrators were aware of it, and maybe the principal was aware of it, and they all colluded to make sure you weren't aware of it. Now, as I said back when I started this conversation, I am just a regular guy, and I've stated this several times during this podcast. I'm a regular guy, and I don't claim to be any level of sophistication beyond what I am, which is just a small business owner, entrepreneur, home builder guy. But I instilled the same values in my children growing up that my parents instilled in me growing up. So my kids have those old school, traditional, conservative values that I grew up with, and that my wife and I grew up with, and we feel very confident that have everything to do with where we are today. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that if I had a child who came home from school and told me that the teachers and or administrators and or school principal, whomever was involved, was aware of something like this going on in their life, where my son or daughter was confused and troubled about their gender and things that are happening with their body and things that are going on in their mind. And if those folks at school colluded to keep that information from me as a parent, it would get very ugly very quickly. I can assure you of that. And examples of this have happened, and there have been parents in this very country who have actually been charged, and in some cases been imprisoned for standing up for their own children, for trying to interfere with what's happening here with their own children. And that's completely upside down to me. This part right here is just, it's crazy to me. And when you talk about this stuff, some folks get super worked up because they take it personally, and they think that you're trying to attack these young children who have some confusion, and they have some mental health issues, and they need some help. But it's not about that. It's not about those children and what their issues might be. It's about what the adults are doing with that information. That just has to stop immediately. Full stop. That this has to stop with what's going on in this country. And if you're not aware of that, if you're not aware that that's even happening, if what I just said there seems far-fetched to you and you think I'm making it up, trust me, I'm not. I could find you tons of examples. If you're paying any attention, you'll know this is going on. And related to these parents that have been charged and just for trying to protect their own children, that brings us to another thing that has changed then versus now, which is the general respect for law enforcement. When I was growing up, and certainly when you as baby boomers were growing up, we had a respect for law enforcement. You taught your children to trust law enforcement. And now there have been examples where, you've seen this before, and not so much recently, because recently crime has gotten so out of control in this country. There was a time when people were calling for the defunding of police, and now we still have this where criminals are being portrayed as the victims. Cops are the bad guys, and the criminals are actually the good guys. The criminals are the victims. That we have going on right now in this country. Right now in this country, it's upside down, where there are scenarios where the public is somehow more concerned with the rights of the criminal than they are with the rights of the victim. It's completely upside down. The conservatives have been screaming about crime for years, and the fact that crime is completely out of control in this country. It's worse than it's ever been. It's far worse than it's ever been. There's no denying that. And that includes crime, white-collar crime going on within the government. The actual scandals and criminal activity and corruption that's going on within the government, specifically the liberal government. Conservatives have supported increased funding and respect for police and correctional officers and first responders. They pushed to toughen bail laws and end this leniency for repeat violent offenders. Again, there's a whole, I could do an entire podcast for an hour and easily just talk about the crime aspect of this thing. But, the liberals up until recently were just sort of pretending that this crime stuff wasn't happening. I mean, the liberals have more so been reducing criminal penalties and support more of like a decarceration policies, I guess you'd call them. And like an example, this would be Bill C-5, which eliminated mandatory minimums for certain crimes, even violent crimes, in the name of equity. So this idea that, again, that a criminal should be treated in some kind of special circumstance because, we should somehow have empathy for this criminal is insane. That's absolutely insanity. And when you as baby boomers were growing up, when you were children and adults, up until you stopped paying attention to the news and only relied on CBC and you don't see what's happening, criminals are the bad guys. That's how it's always been, and that's how it is. The criminals are the bad guys, and the police officers and the victims and those of us over here, we're the good guys. And the fact that the public now stands up for, and the Liberal Party and the leftist political parties stand up for the criminals is completely backwards to what we all know to be true. Another thing that is different from what we all know to be true is this idea of when you grew up, when it came, for instance, to being chosen for something or perhaps being hired for a job, it was always based on merit. It was merit over identity, right? So in other words, it was a time when the best man or woman for the job got the job. And now, hiring and promotions and admissions to schools is based on race and gender and ideology. Merit has become secondary to all these things, if at all. If it is at all considered, it is secondary. And that's not just a bad thing for, that person trying to get that job. That's a bad thing for society as a whole. As a society, we have to recognize that we need the best people to do the job, especially the very important jobs, especially the jobs that involve life or death, potentially. We need the best people in the job. The conservatives oppose hiring or admissions based on race and gender or identity quotas, and they support merit-based evaluation. And they've been pushing back against this, DEI that's been taking place in our government, diversity, equity, inclusion, whereas the liberals promote DEI. They promote DEI hiring practices where identity often, if not always, trumps experience and merit. Example, this would be, they've mandated federal hiring quotas based on race and gender and sexuality even over qualifications. The idea that you would be hired for a job for anything other than your qualifications to perform and do that job is simply insane. But if you're voting liberal this election, that's what you're voting for. You're voting for insanity. Another thing that we're faced with here then versus now is there used to be this delayed gratification and personal responsibility, this sense of personal responsibility and the fact that you worked hard and you saved and you earned what you had. If you wanted something, you earned it. If I want that thing, I want a house, I want a car, I want whatever it is, well then get at it. Work hard and get at it. And now there's the idea of, as a society, there's this instant gratification is the norm now. People, if they can't have what they want, it's immediately somebody else's fault. It's not your fault. It's the system's fault. It's the patriarchy. It's the rich people's fault. It's the business owner's fault. It's the landlord's fault. It's somebody's fault other than your own. And that is in no way how it was when I was growing up. And it definitely isn't how it was when you were growing up as baby boomers. You took responsibility for what you had. Now, if somebody was physically messing with you, if somebody was holding you down or holding you back, that's a different story. But this idea that everything that negative that happened to you or that didn't go your way was somebody else's fault, and the fact that and now people want things when they want them right now, and they think they should get them right now. That's not how we grew up. You want something, you work for it and you earn it. Conservatives encourage saving and personal financial responsibility. And the other thing that the conservatives are promoting, and Poilievre has mentioned and made it very clear in recent weeks, is they're promoting small government. And small government meaning it's not the government's job to provide for you. That's not what they do. That's not what it is. The government is not there to make your life easier so you don't have to work hard and you should be able to have things easier than the people ahead of you. You shouldn't have to do what your parents and grandparents did. Conservatives are promoting home ownership through lower taxes and removing government-imposed barriers and bureaucracy. I've been talking about this a lot on my podcast, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, from a home builder's perspective, when I look at what the conservatives are suggesting versus what the liberals are putting forth, the conservative housing plan is gold. It will absolutely work. It will absolutely, if they do what they say, it will absolutely lower the costs of construction because they're targeting specifically taxation and bureaucracy, and time is money. It will spark more development and more construction because it will the uncertainty will go away and builders and developers can get back to doing what they're doing. But back to this, to what I was talking about, with delayed gratification and the sense of personal responsibility that doesn't seem to exist any longer is the liberals push these endless subsidies and debt-fueled social programs, and they've normalized financial dependency, essentially. They've done this through these massive government spending efforts with no accountability. It leads to wild inflation, and that's why we are in the position we're in. But, the liberal government, the leftist government that we've had for the past 10 years, they've just been throwing money around, literally printing money to try to appease people, to hand out money to people in an attempt to, they would say they're doing it to be helpful. I would say they're doing it to buy votes and persuade people. But that's not sustainable, right? It doesn't work that way. If you're coming into this world thinking that anybody in the world owes you anything, you are mistaken. Nobody in this world owes you anything. If you're lucky, you'll be born into a family with two good parents who are responsible and will take care of you and will look out for you and will raise you right and will provide you with every opportunity to the best of their abilities. And if you live in Canada, you live in a country that also has tremendous opportunity for the time being. We'll see how this election goes. That's all you can ask for. All you can ask for as a human being born into this world is a fair chance and parents who will look after you and keep you safe and teach you what you need to know so that by the time you become an adult, you're equipped with the tools that you need to go be successful and pursue the opportunities that exist. And don't make excuses for yourself. It's nobody else's fault. If it doesn't go the way you want it to, then pull yourself up and get at it again. That's how we used to do it. The last thing I want to comment on that is wildly different now than it was back then when you as baby boomers grew up and I as a Gen X person grew up is the idea and the concept of free speech. Personally, I've said before, I'll repeat it again, I don't think there's anything more important of all the topics, of everything I've discussed here today and of everything that comes up throughout this political race and these campaigns. This one is very clear. I don't know how anyone could argue the other side of this. I don't think anyone would actually sit and argue the other side of this. But, back when years ago, you could disagree with someone and you could still have a civil conversation about it. But more than disagree, you could say what you wanted to say, even if that was not very nice, but it had to be said. And now saying, the quote unquote wrong thing or the wrong opinion, it could get you canceled, it could get you fired, it could get you banned from college campuses or certainly social media or even your job. I had a conversation with a gentleman here months ago who was fired from his job, his 30-year job in the provincial government, essentially for his political views. The conservatives are defending freedom of speech, particularly, on university campuses and online and just in general, Pierre Poilievre has said recently, even in the last couple of weeks or a couple of podcasts I've seen where he reiterates it, he does an excellent job of being very clear about where he stands when it comes to free speech. And where he stands is he vows to protect it. He believes that free speech is essential. And he's correct. Free speech is everything. The conservatives they called a repeal bill C-11 and oppose future bills like C-18, which restrict what Canadians can say or access online. And then there's Bill C-63, which is the Online Harms Act, I think they call it. And that's kind of like bookended at both ends. It looks like it's supposed to be about protecting children. And then in the middle there's all this other stuff that they kind of glaze over, like just little things like, how they're going to appoint a committee, and this committee will then decide if you say something online that they don't like, or you say something anywhere for that matter that they don't like. And if somebody has a problem with that, then they can report it, even anonymously. And if you say something that offends somebody and hurts their feelings, then you can be charged and fined. And the person who reported you doesn't even have to give their name or address or anything. They can be completely anonymous about it and still make the complaint. And then there's some other weird thing where those people can even receive, like when you're fined, the money that you're fined goes to the person who reported you for hurting their feelings. The whole thing is insane. And where we are here today in Canada, we're just trending behind. If the Liberals win this next election, where we're going to be is the UK. And so if you're not aware of what's going on in the UK, I would strongly suggest that you see what's going on and you look into what's going on in the UK with respect to freedom of speech and how people are being arrested for posting memes or saying things that someone might find offensive. The last thing I heard was something like 30 people a day in the UK now are being, I think they said arrested, if not questioned, for the information that they're sharing online that other people find offensive. And just so we're clear, we're not talking about death threats or any of that kind of craziness. We're just saying somebody might have said something that hurt somebody else's feelings. That's all it takes. That's all it takes now in the UK. And that's what's coming here to Canada. And you might not think anything of it because you're thinking, well, you're 70 years old and you're not on social media and you don't say anything to anyone. But there's a clip of an elderly gentleman sitting outside on what looks like a patio of some kind. This is recent. Perhaps we'll try to find it, throw it in here. And the police are questioning this man because he said somewhere in there he must have had an argument with somebody who doesn't perhaps speak English as a first language. And he was being targeted by the police because he said in this argument that he's having with someone, he told them he can't understand them and he told them to speak English. Now, he probably said it in a way, trying to be a jerk, right? He's probably like, I don't know what you're saying, bud, speak English, right? That's what we would say here. That's what you would say here if you were arguing with somebody. But in this clip, you can see the police officers questioning him about this. And the problem is they're actually telling him if he said that, then, perhaps he could be charged by that because he said something that offended someone. And it can be construed then or interpreted as hate speech. You wouldn't believe it unless you looked into it. If you haven't looked into it, honestly, you really need to. You need to see what's coming down the pipe. The Liberals introduce internet regulation and censorship bills under the guise of safety and protecting you from quote unquote hate speech. But that's not at all what it is. It's control. They're trying to censor you and they're trying to control you and all of us. Like I mentioned, Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, which gives the CRTC power to regulate online content, and then other things like Bill C-63 and so on. Okay, those are a handful of things that perhaps maybe some of the baby boomers, and maybe not even, maybe some of the Gen X folks that remember things being different back then than they are now. To try to put it in layman's terms, I'm just trying to lay it out there for you because, again, I, for the life of me, cannot understand how anybody at this point in this country, in Canada, would be voting Liberal. I honestly cannot understand it. Now, when it comes to the baby boomer generation, I would assume that much of the reason why that's happening is because the boomers are uninformed, because you're still getting your media. You're in that 4% of the population that still gets their news from CBC. And if that's where you're getting your news, there in each other, and maybe some Facebook stuff, whatever it is, and you're not aware of any of these things, if anything that I said here today you're hearing for the first time, then you should be very concerned, because these things are all over the place. Like, none of this should come as a surprise to you. You should have heard about all these things. And if you really sit there and think about it, and you're being honest with yourself, and you're thinking how things were versus how things are, and then you look at which political party is essentially wanting to take things back to how they were, or even just keep things the way they are, perhaps. And then you have this other party, the Liberal Party, who very clearly want to keep moving it in the direction it's been going for the past 10 years. If you're still voting for that, for the Liberal Party, I, for the life of me, cannot understand where your head's at. And so as one last-ditch effort, I figured I'd run through this. Maybe somebody will find something interesting here. Maybe it will open some eyes. Maybe somebody will then go look up something I've said here and realize for themselves that it's true. But between now and the time the election happens, we still have, this week we have debates, and next week they have debates, and hopefully people will see these candidates for who they really are and be honest with themselves about it. I will mention two things that I think you should watch. Pierre Poilievre did a couple of podcasts recently. I don't remember the name of the host at this point. Not somebody I'd ever heard of, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, one podcast Poilievre did with his wife, the other one he was there solo. But it's very candid, open conversation, very genuine conversation. And if you watch that and you listen to him and you listen to what he has to say, when I listen to it, I just don't understand how anybody isn't voting for Poilievre at this point. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking at him as a person, just set politics aside for a second. If you just listen to what he has to say, and he's being very clear about it. He's not, there's no smoke and mirrors. He's not using strange terminology. He's not sort of leaving himself away to back out of it. He's very clearly stating where he stands on these issues. And he just sounds like a regular, sensible, common sense person, although he's very smart. You can tell when you listen to him. He's a very smart guy. There's no question this guy is smart. Very smart. And when it comes to what you would ask for in a politician, my interpretation of Poilievre is that he's honest, whether you like what he's saying or not. He's being honest about it. He's genuine, and he's very smart. And I don't know what else more you could ask for out of a politician. The other guy, Mark Carney, is absolutely not being honest with you about anything. And he's not necessarily trying to hide anything, because you can't hide what he is and what his past is and who he's associated with and what his business connections are and some of the decisions that he's made, and the book that he's written that very clearly illustrates what his values are. When you look at those two things, I just don't understand how anyone is choosing liberal over conservative. Unless, of course, like I said, you're wildly misinformed, or, you're just bitter. You just have this chip on your shoulder. Like, it wouldn't matter who was running for the Conservative Party. You just never vote conservative. Okay, fine, I get it. But for those of you who aren't in that scenario, do yourself a favor. Find the podcast that Poilievre did recently on YouTube. Perhaps we'll put a link to them down below. Also, do yourself another favor. Find the episode on Jordan Peterson's podcast where he speaks about Mark Carney and who Mark Carney is. I've watched it. Jordan Peterson is absolutely one of the most influential Canadians alive today. He is incredibly intelligent, incredibly articulate, and just an amazing communicator. Poilievre was on a show, also a fantastic episode. But in this episode where Jordan Peterson is discussing Mark Carney, he lays it out for you. He's not just bad-mouthing Mark Carney. As a matter of fact, the first probably 20 minutes he spends kind of pumping his tires and telling you, explaining what Mark Carney's resume is, which he admittedly says is a very attractive resume. He went to Harvard and Oxford. Those are great schools. And he went there in, I think it was the 80s. And back when universities were something entirely different than what they are now. So he's not discrediting Carney's education or experience, but he goes on to talk about his book and the values in his book, which is also called Values. But he's talking about those things and he's bringing them to light and he's articulating them very clearly. And you would be doing yourself an injustice not to listen to that episode. Anyway, thanks for listening today. I hope you could take a little bit from this. As I said earlier, if you haven't already, do me a solid, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and hopefully things will go in a positive direction after this next election. And then we'll all be done talking about it and we can move on and just start talking about some more entertaining and lighthearted things. Thanks very much and have a good day.